Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. I'm Kat. I'm the class of 2021, and welcome to Reunion Talks, Global Hotspots with Ambassador Christopher Hill. Chris Hill is the Chief Global Advisor and Professor at the University of Denver. Prior to this, he was the Dean of the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the university, a position he held from September 2010 until December 2017. In addition to overseeing the university's Office of Global Engagement, Chris is author of Outpost, Life on the Front Lines of American Diplomacy, a memoir, a monthly columnist for the Project Syndicate, and a voice in the media on international affairs. Chris is a career diplomat, having been nominated as ambassador 4 times by 3 presidents. His last post was as ambassador to Iraq, which he held from 2009 until 2010. Prior to Iraq, Chris served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2005 until 2009, during which he was also the head of the U.S. delegation in 6 party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue. Earlier, he was the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea, Poland, the Republic of Macedonia, and the special envoy to Kosovo. Chris also served as a special assistant to the president and as a senior director on the staff of the National Security Council from 1999 to 2000. He received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award for his work on Bosnia in 2003. And he was awarded Bowdoin's Gordon S. Hargraves 19 Preservation of Freedom Prize. In 2014, Chris was awarded an honorary degree from Bowdoin, and he delivered the keynote address at baccalaureate. Chris is a member of the class of 1974, a Bowdoin parent, honorary degree recipient, and has a master's degree from the Naval War College. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Hill.
Thank you very much, Kat. That was very kind of you to go through that resume. I know that took a little time. But the most important thing wasn't there, which is we're here on the 45th anniversary of the Bowdoin's defeating Wesleyan College, Wesleyan University, in lacrosse, small college championship. Mort LaPointe only hit me a couple of times over the head during the Mort, I hope you're here. It's just a joke, don't hit me again. But most importantly, we beat them 15-7, and they had a player who's never been heard from since, that is Bill Belichick. I don't know whatever happened to him, but he sure isn't playing lacrosse anymore. So anyway, great to be back here at Bowdoin. I must say, when I graduated from Bowdoin, it was funny because you got all these exams, everything seems to come at the same time, papers, and then I joined the Peace Corps, and within a month I was on a plane. It was a Pan American airplane. It took like 24 hours to get to Cameroon, and I got off the plane in Cameroon, this driving rainstorm. You go past all these security guys who carry machine guns as they're checking your passport. I ended up in this in what the Peace Corps said was a luxury hotel. It wasn't. And then for about 6 months, I'd wake up with nightmares about whether I had turned in a paper at Bowdoin. So such is the power of coming to Bowdoin. And I must say, every time I come to alumni events, it takes a few days before I sleep soundly and not thinking, oh. So fortunately, I was able to see David Vail today, Professor Vail, and get another extension on my paper. I really appreciate that, because now I'll be able to sleep well. Well, I'll be able to sleep well in certain respect, because not in other respects, because you've asked me to talk about foreign policy today in the United States, and I've been thinking, I think I was invited here in February, and I was thinking, can I say something nice? So I've been working on that since February, and no luck. But I must say, one of my past assignments, as Kat mentioned, I was ambassador in Poland. And many years ago, before my time in Poland, there was a Communist Party first secretary named Władysław Gomułka, a name otherwise lost to history, but I'm bringing him back because he was known for, he was kind of a brutal guy, but he's known for these really long speeches and not particularly successful metaphors. And one day, Władysław Gomułka stood up in front of a big crowd in Kraków in southern Poland and said, "Comrades, just a few years ago, our fatherland stood on the very edge of a deep abyss. And I'm here to tell you today, comrades, we've taken an important step forward." So I think, inspired by the words of Władysław Gomułka, maybe I'll get into talking about the subject that I'm here to talk about, which is, with foreign policy, what are the challenges out there? And I guess we have to talk about where we're going to go from here, in fact. I would like to make one point, because when you see so much stuff written, there's this word, everything gets turned into an ism, and it's called declinism. And it's the notion that somehow the U.S. is sort of past its prime, that other countries are going to sort of take from our hands, actually we seem to be throwing it away, the mantle of international leadership, and that soon we will have, countries, whether it's China or whatever, sort of running the world, and we will be a bit player. And what I think Americans need to understand is we never really chose this role in the first place. It was kind of thrust on us in that very tumultuous 20th century. But I'm not sure we're really going to be giving up that role. We can take time out to have a nervous breakdown from time to time. I promised myself I'm not going to say anything political, but I promised my wife, actually, I wouldn't say anything political, but Julie's not here, so I'm just going to, So, but I think we have to understand that when you look around the world for leadership, there is a great craving for our leadership. And I think to a great extent, we're failing people around the world right now. We're not responding in the way we need to respond. But it doesn't mean that we're somehow, relegated to the dustbin of history. I think we are going to be able to come back. And I think, the Europeans in particular, they always sort of, they seem to want our leadership, but they never seem to want to agree with what we wanted to say or do. Kind of reminiscent of the old Woody Allen line about the two people talking about the restaurant. They say, well, the food is terrible and the portions are too small. I think to a great extent, many... All right, everyone get that joke? We move on. All right. So, I think to some extent people, wanted the leadership and then didn't want to do what we suggested that we do. So I think to a great extent, all that process needs to be rebuilt, where when we go to one of these countries, where we go to one of these regions, we do a good job of listening, we do a good job of giving due respect to what people's opinions are, decent respect for the opinions of others, and kind of take it from there. I mean, I think to a great extent, what we're seeing today is the culmination of something I never thought I would see in the United States. I certainly have seen it in some of the other countries I've served in, but we are becoming kind of professional victims as a country. We sort of take the view that somehow this panoply of international institutions, of the whole international relations, is somehow a vast conspiracy to sort of pull us back and sort of make us do things that we otherwise don't want to do. And I think we need to, first of all, understand that many of these institutions of global governance were created by us. I mean, we did it. And to hear a Secretary of State, as Secretary of State Pompeo did in Brussels back in December, to say that somehow the World Bank is all wrong, it needs to be reformed, if it won't reform, we're going to have to get rid of it. You know, I think when you look at an institution like the World Bank, when you look at an institution like the IMF, when you look at these things, you need to have some respect for the people who went to work to get this done. And when you think of that Bretton Woods conference, just a few miles from here, frankly, a couple of 100 miles or 100 miles from here, and you think that they were meeting at a time when our troops were still getting out of the hedgerows in Normandy, it should give you some pause to the wisdom of what those people were doing at Bretton Woods and setting up this international system, and a system that I think has really served us very well. And I think we need to get back to the view that these are not conspiracies against our interests. You know, I remember when I was at Bowdoin, there was a sign out on a field somewhere near Brunswick that said, "Get the U.S. out of the UN." And you would think that the UN was some kind of conspiracy against our interests. We created the thing, for heaven's sakes. I mean, you don't have to be an ancient historian to know what went on in San Francisco right after World War II. So we need to understand these institutions are there for global governance, to be sure, but they're there to really help us manage issues. So I think, you know, handling allies, working with others is not easy. I mean, there was a reason Napoleon once said, "My greatest strength is that I have no allies." But in fact, if we're going to tackle these problems, if we're going to tackle them successfully, we need to work with others. So let me start with my favorite issue, which is North Korea. A people only a mother can love. You just want to pick them up and hug them. But we have a major problem there, but we have a major problem there not just because of North Korea's nuclear ambitions. We need to understand why they have those nuclear ambitions, and then we need to work with others, countries where in a place like South Korea, I mean, people can actually see North Korea from their bedroom window. So if Sarah Palin went to South Korea, she could see it from someone's bedroom window, or you know, maybe a hotel window. So we need to understand that if you're South Korea and you're hearing people in Washington say there's nothing that's going to solve this except looking at, you know, kinetic action, that is using, you know, some type of military approach to North Korea. You have to remember we have almost 50 million South Koreans who live right there, and they want to see some effort, really, to that we will understand the importance of diplomacy and the importance of solving things peacefully, because that's where they live. So I think the president, I think was correct to look for an approach to North Korea that did not involve going to war with North Korea. But, you know, as a professional diplomat, you do sort of look for some effort to be professional in how you go about it. And we haven't seen a lot of that, and I think the consequence is that we're probably not going to have a lot of progress on North Korea, and that is an issue that my daughter is having a son in 2 weeks, and I told my daughter I think the newly born Henry is going to have to be dealing with North Korea during his lifetime as well, because it's a tough issue. So let's look at what happened in North Korea. The president had a policy of kind of really sort of ratcheting up the threat levels. This was in the fall of 2017. I mean, Americans who are sort of worried about, you know, by December of 2017, people who are worried about how they're going to survive their relatives for Christmas now sort of wondered how they're going to survive nuclear war at Christmas. And so it all looked very dangerous. The president got into this, I would say, unproductive discussion with the North Koreans as to who has a bigger button and issues like that. And it looked pretty bleak. But then Kim Jong-un got up on his New Year's Day address in January 2018 and said, and indicated at least that he would like to find a peaceful way forward. He actually endorsed the idea of South Korea having the Olympics. And, you always worry when the North Koreans talk like that because it's sort of like, hey, nice Olympics you're going to have. I hope nothing happens to them. But on the other hand, they seem to want to sort of change their tune. South Koreans sent a team right up to Pyongyang very quickly and to try to explore whether there's something behind this sort of apparent interest in approaching the, in a kind of rapprochement. And in fact, Kim Jong-un said what every North Korean leader, that is his father and his grandfather, have said in the past, that he'd like to meet with the American president. South Koreans immediately come back to Seoul, report to President Moon Jae-in, and they go to Washington to tell the American side that actually the North Koreans seem to be taking a new look at this, and they want to meet with President Trump. Before they can finish what was on their minds in front of the then National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, President Trump walked into McMaster's office and said, hey, let's have it over in the Oval Office, which was the South Koreans were thinking in terms of the Oval Office, something their president goes to. They go to the National Security Advisor's office. Nonetheless, they came over, the president heard them out, and he said, if you were a career diplomat like myself, you would like the president to say something like, thank you very much for coming this long way to convey this very important message. The fact that Kim Jong-un wants to meet with me that's important stuff, and I want to discuss this with my advisors, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. That's how, those of us in the State Department would like to see this done. The president said, sure, I'll do it. And then when you have stuff like this done, you usually like to have the NSC spokesperson or maybe the White House spokesperson get out and say the president has agreed to meet with Kim Jong-un. Instead, they had the South Korean head of the National Intelligence Agency, the Korean CIA, make the announcement in front of the West Wing of the White House to the effect that President Trump has agreed to meet with Kim Jong-un. So again, you don't usually do it that way, but whatever, we got the thing going. So then the issue is in diplomacy, you never go to a summit where you don't know what's going to happen in the summit. I mean, every lawyer knows the point that you don't ask a question unless you know what the answer is. In diplomacy, you don't have a summit unless you know what's going to be agreed at the summit. And usually that's done through something called a draft joint communique. So normally you send a team to the other side and say, we're very pleased, our two leaders are meeting. We have put together a draft joint communique. Please read it. You may have some disagreements with it. You may have some of your own ideas. We're patient. We have a lot of time. Let's try to do that. Well, this never happened. So what in fact happened is they got to Singapore. Remember, there was a sort of cliffhanger as to where it was going to be. And the president was taking a walk with Kim Jong-un, and he turned to the press and said, oh, we have to go do the signing, and no one knew what the signing was going to be about. And so we then saw the president and Kim Jong-un enter, and again, these asymmetries, again, I don't mean to be too sort of stick-in-the-mud career diplomat, but if one president is going to have his sister turn the pages of the documents so he can sign them, and then the other president, if he doesn't have a sister, he probably shouldn't be using the Secretary of State, but there was Secretary Pompeo turning the documents for President Trump. We didn't know what was in this agreement, but fortunately we live in an era of iPhones, so the president, did that chainsaw signature, held it up, and a Japanese journalist took a picture of it with an iPhone, and that's how we found out what the document was. Again, normally what you like to do is to have a little pre-brief, and you like to say, today the president, this is embargoed information until 3:01 this afternoon, but the president will be signing an agreement with Kim Jong-un. I would draw your attention to paragraph 2, paragraph 4, paragraph 5. In paragraph 2, we have agreed to work with them on a treaty. I mean, you go through all the elements. so that as soon as it's signed, boom, the press is out. And basically, even without kind of talking to doubting Thomases about it, they have a sense that, okay, this is really going forward. Well, no one had an idea. As someone who'd worked with the North Koreans, and I signed a number of documents with them, and the most important of them was in September 19th, 2005. The issue was to get North Korea on the record that they were going to dismantle, do away with their nuclear weapons. They did that, and in fact, not to go through ancient history with you, but in our case, the problem came when eventually we had the issue of whether we could verify undeclared sites. That is, when they said they're going to dismantle these weapons, we needed to be able to say, yes, but what about that facility over there? And their point was, if we haven't agreed to identify a facility, you're not going to get to inspect a facility. So we had those kinds of issues. We were down to that kind of granularity. In President Trump's document, there was no granularity at all. It was North Korea agrees to give up its nuclear weapons. Well, where's the time marker there? What's the concept of how that's going to be done? And then what is going to be the U.S. response? Because in September 2005, we laid out all the things that we were going to do. We're going to provide them energy assistance, economic assistance. We're going to do cross-recognition of states. We were going to sign a peace treaty. It was all kind of laid out there. In the document in Singapore, it was as if we never knew that something had happened before that day in Singapore. You know, the idea that history began in Singapore. So, so it wasn't at all clear when the North Koreans said, we want to give up our nuclear weapons. What do they mean? During the end of time? Is it a biblical concept of you know, when the lions lie down with the lambs, you know, they'll give up their nuclear weapons? By the way, there's a museum in Israel where there's a lion lying down with a lamb, and I remember asking the guy, how do you do that? And he said, we put in a new lamb every day. And so, so you need some kind of time marker. We had a concept in our document that they would return to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation, which would make them a non-nuclear state at an early date. You know, you try to kind of tighten this stuff up. Very little effort to tighten this stuff up, but you recall the president said, all solved. Well, he sends Secretary of State Pompeo back out to North Korea. And by the way, you'll note that in the press conference in Singapore, the president also mentioned, hey, I'd like to bring home the U.S. troops. Well, that's big stuff. That's very big stuff when you start talking about, okay, North Koreans, if you give up your nukes, we will withdraw our troops. Well, the problem with that is this is precisely what China has wanted for many years. Get the U.S. off of the Korean Peninsula. But is that something we're prepared to do? Does North Korea have the right, essentially, to tell the U.S., you have to abrogate, you have to cancel the agreement with South Korea? Because if you go back to what happened in 1950, we had actually left. We took the surrender of Japanese troops in 1945, and we were off the peninsula. So when the North Koreans invaded, there were no U.S. troops there, and we had to bring them in a big hurry. And you recall, it took us, we almost lost all the Korean peninsula. We were back there in September 1950, but it was pretty tough going. So is this what the North Koreans are looking for? Very hard to say because they haven't laid out anything. And so the president kind of, by saying, I want to remove the troops, he started worrying our allies, Japan and South Korea. And if you're South Korea and you kind of have wanted this to calm down, I mean, it's a good thing that it's calmed down, but then the president has talked about pulling the troops out, you begin to worry, well, what is the cost of this? Because we know that's been the age-old North Korean desire to get U.S. troops off, and also China. And then the question is, if you have troops in Japan, and just to give you a kind of order of magnitude, we have about 28,000 U.S. troops in South Korea. and we have about 50,000 troops in Japan. And then we have a whole process whereby if the troops in South Korea if there's an invasion from the north, the troops do certain things, but then we bring in some troops in Japan, and then more importantly, we bring in other troops who stop in Japan and then go into, it's a whole complex process. Well, will Japan be willing to be the only country in Asia to have permanently stationed U.S. troops? I think right now they would be. I mean, if you said to a Japanese right now, you know, we're going to pull our troops out of Korea, are you okay with being the only country in Asia to have U.S. troops on your soil, permanently assigned to your soil? You know, they'd say yes today. What would they say 20 years from now? What would they say in the future? Because after all, when did our troops come to Japan? They came as part of an occupation force. And later I'm going to talk a little about Iraq, and some of the same sentiments are going to be there. So you've got to be a little careful when you say things to the press that you're going to pull the troops out. So the president, I think, you know, on his way home, he said the issue's over. Well, the issue wasn't over. He sent Pompeo over to North Korea, and Pompeo came back, Secretary Pompeo came back, and the North Koreans did not give him a meeting with Kim Jong-un. You know, again, when you deploy your Secretary of State, when you put him in the game, you expect their president, the president of a small country like North Korea, you expect their president to meet with Kim Jong-un and to meet with Pompeo. It didn't happen. And then Pompeo comes out of there. He had to do a little work with the South Koreans and the Japanese, obviously. And he comes out of there, and the North Koreans said he acted like a gangster. Well, you know, that wasn't very positive. What did our president say about that? He said, my friend Kim Jong-un, you know, we're good to go. We'll be fine. Well, one thing, I don't care whether you're playing lacrosse at Bowdoin, whatever you're doing, you stick up for your teammates. And you make it clear to, you know, if the North Koreans think they can tell President Trump who his Secretary of State should be, they should think again. But President Trump has never defended Pompeo publicly to the North Koreans, and never even defended, and this is a tougher job, never even defended his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, whom the North Koreans have described at various times as words that are not really appropriate to family time television, but they have made very clear they don't like John Bolton. So you kind of wonder, the president is kind of setting this situation up to where only he can negotiate with the North Koreans. And as much as lacrosse is too, diplomacy is a team sport. And you don't want your president negotiating nuclear weapons. And so what has happened since Singapore, we had, of course, a meeting in Hanoi, but what has happened is essentially North Korea has dug in its heels. They've not agreed to move forward. They've not kind of engaged the president in some of the issues he's talked about, but in the meantime, they're saying they won't deal with his two advisors, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. So to get around to this spring, the North Koreans put an offer on the table. And the offer had to do with dismantling the main nuclear facility, a place called Yongbyon. It's the site of their only plutonium facility. Remember, there are two ways to a bomb. One is through plutonium and another is through highly enriched uranium, the sort of things the Iranians have had, these centrifuges. And we know for a fact that Yongbyon is the only place where they have a graphite-moderated plutonium-producing reactor. We don't know where their uranium enrichment facilities are. We know there's one in Yongbyon, but we suspect there are ones elsewhere. So the North Koreans came up with an offer in Hanoi to do away with Yongbyon. Well, it's their main facility. It's about a 3 square mile facility. The fact that they are willing to really dismantle it, they said with foreign observers of the dismantling, in my view, it was interesting. I've been to Yongbyon. I've been inside the reactor. It looks a little, frankly speaking, like a Romanian textile mill. But you know, it's producing. You know, you take the fuel rods out, you put them in a pond, then you transfer them over to this reprocessing facility, and most of their fissile material has come out of Yongbyon. So when I heard that from the North Koreans, I thought, you know, it might be worth having a look at. Now, the question is, what price? Because the North Koreans were suggesting that they wanted sanctions relief. Well, here's the problem, and anyone who's studied sort of war termination or conflict termination, you can see these problems. They say they want sanctions relief, and they seem to indicate they wanted a lot of it, such that they could get back energy materials. That is, they've been selling coal for Chinese processed petroleum. So as soon as they said they wanted sanctions relief in the energy sector, the other side, our side, says, well, wait a minute, that must really mean something to them. Let's not ever do that. And so that's, I mean, if you look back to Thucydides and war termination, you'll see when one side offers something, the other side says, oh, they're weak, therefore we're not going to give that to them. And so rather than say, well, how much sanctions relief, or make a counter proposal, our president talked to the North Koreans for 5 hours in Hanoi and essentially said, no, I want it all done at once. I want it all, and I want it now. Sounding like a millennial that he's not, but anyway. So the North Koreans were kind of stunned. It's possible that the U.S. side had good reason not to engage on this offer. I'm telling you, though, to give Yongbyon away, crown jewel, so to speak, it might have been worth more than a 5-hour discussion. So we left. The North Koreans haven't known what to do about this. You've heard that Kim Young-chol, their main nuclear negotiator, we know that he was imprisoned after this. There's a South Korean report this week that he was executed. Someone asked me, Washington Post called me the other day and said, did you ever feel that your North Korean interlocutor was negotiating for his life? I said, that's a wonderful thought, but no, I didn't. And besides, that's his problem, not mine. But a serious problem if what Chosun Ilbo said. So I don't think we're anywhere on this at this point. In the meantime, there are reports from the UN that North Korea is suffering more agricultural harvest failure. And so there may be a repeat of the famine of the late 90s. Well, there are people in the Trump administration who get excited about this, say, aha, now they're really desperate because they have starving children. Well, I've looked at regime change around the world. I've never seen a starving 5-year-old overthrow a dictatorship. So I think the Trump administration ought to, stand down on this and look to work through the UN to provide humanitarian assistance, which I don't think should be mixed up with the issue of sanctions with nuclear weapons. So right now we have a situation where the North Koreans seem to be going after their own negotiators. In the meantime, they seem to be going after our negotiators, and they've indicated the only person they'll talk to is the president, and the president says things are going very well. Well, they're not. So the question will be, how will North Korea sort of bang their spoon on the high chair and get attention? And what they seem to be doing now is short-range missile launches. But you saw that the president is standing next to Shinzo Abe in Japan, the Japanese prime minister, who is pretty hard line on North Korea. I mean, Japan has no patience with North Korea. They don't have a lot of patience with South Korea because South Korea has probably too much patience with North Korea. So the president stands next to Shinzo Abe, and Abe just said that North Korea's firing of this missile, which is about a 135-mile missile, it couldn't reach Japan, but they say the Japanese said it's a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And John Bolton said it was a violation of UN Security Council resolution. Pompeo, I don't think, said anything, but the president got up and said, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. My friend Kim Jong-un will, I have confidence in him. Well, good for him. But, and you recall they fell in love, according to, but again, I would call on the great North Korea negotiator Tina Turner, who pointed out, what's love got to do with it? It has to do with, are we going to sit down? Are we going to be able to get some deal? And what is the sequencing of the various proposals? Now, there are people who say they'll never give up their nuclear weapons. First of all, never is a long time, so never use the word never. And secondly, I think the issue is, can you kind of present a situation where North Korea sort of understands that life with nuclear weapons is more problematic than life without nuclear weapons? And as I suggested earlier, North Korea having nuclear weapons is not to protect against a U.S. attack. We have no intention of attacking North Korea. We put that in writing several times. We've said it many times, and they know it. The reason they want nuclear weapons is to create a circumstance where, with U.S. troops in South Korea, whether this president, the next president, or the president, the Sarah Palin's second term, someone will say, do we really need troops in South Korea? They're a robust country. They don't really need us there. So maybe we could get our troops out of there. So what you have to think of in the North Korean nuclear program is an effort to decouple the U.S. from South Korea, which is what they were frustrated by in 1950. And so I hope our president makes very clear to the North Koreans that we can talk about a lot of things, but we're not going to talk about the U.S.-South Korean alliance, which is one of the best alliances we have going. Because if the president begins to kind of impair that alliance, what happens elsewhere? Because as we know, in Europe, I just got back from France last week. I mean, it's so amazing. I was at an American cemetery where there were about 2,000 Americans who were killed in a space of like two or three weeks in 1918. And the French were out there they had French soldiers dressed up as American World War I soldiers. We had, various monuments commissions, and then no one from the American embassy. And the French are beginning to wonder, how committed are we in Europe? And frankly, I think a lot of our European allies are worrying about that. And when they see a sort of lack of commitment, perhaps in South Korea, they begin to worry, is our country really committed to this? Committed to a sort of forward defense. These are not transactional relationships. These are deep relationships. You know, when you're a diplomat and you're trying to get someone to do something, you don't say, hey, I helped you out last week with that thing, and could you help me out this week? I remember talking to my first ambassadorship, I was talking to the Prime Minister of Macedonia, a guy named Branko Crvenkovski, and I remember I wanted him to do something. It was kind of, frankly, it was interfering in their internal affairs. It was about getting Albanian language in certain schools, and this is what you often do as an ambassador. And Branko said, I don't want to do this. You have no idea. If I say the Albanians can speak Albanian in their schools in Debar and Gostivar and western part of Macedonia, then next thing you know, it's just going to be, I'm going to get so much criticism. But he said, I understand this is not coming from you, that is the ambassador. I understand this is a big deal with the administration in Washington, and I understand that you're looking at this from the point of view of validating the Dayton Accords in Bosnia. I got it, and I value your relationship, because if this little country of mine, Macedonia, is going to survive, it's going to survive because you're with us, and so I'm going to do it. So he did it. And so it's not about, a transaction. It's about the fact that they value the relationship. When we were trying to get, you do a lot of commercial stuff in the Foreign Service. We were trying to get the Poles to buy 46 F-16 Block 50s, high-performance aircraft, probably the best in our arsenal at the time in 2003. And I remember the Poles saying, Uh, the, the Brits are practically offering this thing to us for nothing. This Gripen, it was sort of a Saab with wings on it or something. But I mean, with due respect, I mean, anyway. But the Polish prime minister said, but we're not just buying an airframe, he said. We're buying a relationship with your Air Force. We want to fly with your Air Force. You know, that's why we're in this. And, you know, anyone who thinks, you know, that we were down to you buy our airplanes and we'll buy your kielbasa kind of completely misses the point. I mean, yes, there are those economic issues, but they completely miss the point of what alliances really are. And a lot of it is showing up. You know, I think the old adage is, you know, showing up is 80%. I would say showing up is 90%, including at cemeteries, by the way. So I think the U.S. is doing a lot of damage to itself for no reason. It's sort of own goal type stuff. I mean, it's you know, picking fights with people we don't need to pick fights with. I think everyone knows you got to choose your battles. You know, I've been a dean, which in some respects was worse than dealing with the North Koreans, although to you faculty members, I don't mean to be unkind, but and it's true you don't have nuclear weapons, but you know, it was you got to pick your battles. And I think we have a president who seems to think that the more battles, the better. We're weakening our alliances around the world right now, and we're using tools that are frankly weapons of war. I mean, tariffs are a very weaponized form of you know, a trade dispute. We're kind of pushing aside institutions such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which we created. Don't forget, we did this stuff. We weren't sitting, you know, watching baseball and then some European called us and said, by the way, we've just created the WTO, hope you can live with it. We did it. And I think there's a complete lack of understanding in our administration and perhaps to some extent in our general public that, you know, we made this world in our image for a reason. When I look at the Middle East, we can see that there's I think a complete failure to understand what is frankly going on there. I must say when I got to Iraq in 2010, it was kind of appalling because we were still talking about Iraq being you know, you had some people who wanted dictatorship and other people who wanted democracy. Well, that's easy enough. Believe me, it's far more complex than that. And we didn't do our homework on Iraq as a country. And so we went in there kind of missing the Shia-Sunni divide. And then when we finally caught up to it, you know, you go into Iraq, you've got, I mean, just look at the demographics. 20% Kurds, 20% Arab Sunnis, 60% Arab Shia Arab. So you have an election, because Americans like elections. You know, if we have an election should be able to sort this thing out in a hurry. Well, when you have an election, and you don't have any institutions underlying the election, who do you think the 60% Shia Arabs are going to vote for? They're going to vote for Shia Arabs. And the reason is when you don't have institutions, when you don't have civil governance, people resort to other forms of loyalty and protection. In the case of Iraq, they resorted to a sectarian identity. And so, unbeknownst to us, because we hadn't thought it through, we thought we were fighting something called Baathism. And Baathism was simply a creation for the Iraqis of it was a secular vessel into which you had this sectarian identity of being Sunni. So all the Sunnis were Baathists, and they would say, well, you know, we're not saying it has to be only Sunnis. I mean, anyone's free to join the Baathist party. So this is not about Sunni, but it was about Sunni. The Baathist party ran the place, meaning 20% Sunnis ran the country. So we create democracy there, and lo and behold, the Shia then start running the country. And the Shia then internally pick the toughest Shia they can, and so the toughest Shia they can is then running the country. Well, they picked a guy named Nouri al-Maliki. He would not be someone you'd want at your Thanksgiving table, believe me. So we would tell Nouri al-Maliki, you need to do outreach to the Sunnis. Sort of like when Nelson Mandela came in, Nelson Mandela in South Africa looked at a 20% proposition, that is white South Africans. And what did Nelson Mandela do? Well, he was a man of just extraordinary vision. He reaches out to the 20% white South Africans. You remember the Matt Damon movie where, Nelson Mandela, agrees to go to rugby matches, which were sort of the equivalent of lacrosse in South Korea, sort of only white guys did that, and soccer was what everyone else played. But Nelson Mandela tried to reach out to the white South Africans. I'd look at Maliki and I'd say, you got to reach out, and then I realized I'm looking at this guy and I'm thinking, Nelson Mandela, there's no one more charismatic than Nelson Mandela, and I'm looking at Nouri al-Maliki and I'm thinking, if he ever had charisma, it cleared up a long time ago. So it's going to be a long process before we get political parties in Iraq that are issues-based parties that are interested in, more social welfare, and get some Sunnis who might be interested in that, some Shia who might be interested in that, and they're in some social welfare party. So instead, you're going to get this sectarian divide, and it's tough. But meanwhile, as if that wasn't enough, that we didn't understand what was going on in Iraq, take a step back and look at the overall Middle East. There is no country in the Middle East that is run by Shia. We'll put Syria out to the side for a second here. So the entire Middle East is a Sunni-run part of the world. Sunnis are 90%. They're 100%, almost 100% in some countries, but in Iraq, they're actually a minority. But only in Iraq and Bahrain are they a minority. And still, before we invaded, even those two countries, Iraq and Bahrain, were run by the Sunnis. So if you're a Sunni living in Iraq, you're only 20%, and now you're going to live under the indignity of Shia rule, who they consider a bunch of goat herders. I mean, if you go out to Anbar and talk to Sunni sheikhs, you don't hear a lot of good stuff about the Shia. I mean, they have absolutely no respect for Shia. And then you wonder, why do these people have such strategic depth, think they have such strategic depth that they think they can be dictating terms to the Shia majority? Answer, they have Sunnis all the way to Morocco. They feel this strategic depth. So we created a situation where the Saudis, looking north of their border, said, what are you Americans doing? What are you doing? We can live with the Israel thing, though don't expect us to say it, but what have you done to endanger our whole northern frontier and to create the conditions for Shia-led, because this is out of the Arab Middle East, Shia-led Iran, a Persian country. So what are you doing? Well, in the meantime, of course, Iran had a nuclear program, and so the Bush administration looked at it, tried some tentative efforts at negotiation, essentially pulled back. Using the same career diplomats, mainly Bill Burns, the Obama administration got into it, and before you know it, they had a pretty decent deal. I mean, it ain't perfect, but you should compare it to North Korea. It wasn't bad, to limit what Iran could do. They got most of the fissile material out of there. By the way, you could spin to 20%. That's not weapons grade, but there's nothing in the technology to go to 90% that you can't do if you can get to 20%. So it's dangerous to have any kind of fissile material, even low enriched uranium. So this administration, in fact, many critics were saying, but Iran is a malign influence in the region. Yes, it is. And therefore, why didn't you take that up? Well, we're engaged in a process with the Iranians. We got the Europeans there. We've got the Russians and Chinese there, and our side has some sidebar conversations with the Iranians, and we want to open up the idea of their malign influence. They are supporting Hezbollah, which is a Shia-led group in just over the northern Israel frontier. And they've been supporting Bashar al-Assad, which is a Alawite regime more allied with the Syrians. So we wanted to have a discussion with the Iranians to say, cut that out. So we go to our other partners, And we went to some countries, Arab countries, that weren't in the nuclear talks, such as Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis said, if you're going to start engaging on regional issues, we, the Saudis, have to be there. And if we're going to be there, United Arab Emirates need to be there. And before you know it, you have a conference where you'd have more Arabs at the conference than you would have people dealing with the nuclear issues. And you have to remember the nuclear issues, the negotiation took place with nuclear powers, that is Russia, China, US, and Britain, France. And also Germany was in it, so they're the only non-nuclear state that was in those talks. So the decision of all these was not to engage regional players, but to try to get a deal on the nuclear process, try to put that genie back in the bottle, and then maybe deal with it later. The president comes in, he talks to the Saudis. The Saudis see this kind of what they are concerned about to be a sort of beginning of a U.S.-Iranian relationship. What are the Saudis thinking? They're thinking of the days when we sat with the Shah of Iran, and they don't draw a big distinction between the Ayatollahs and the Shah of Iran, and they say, you were buddies with Shah of Iran, you expected him to kind of keep this part of the world in check. Now we see your dance partner is once again the Iranians. We're not going to put up with it. And so the Saudis made very clear to the Trump administration, we don't like this, and we want you to do away with this thing. In the meantime, the U.S. talks to Israel, and Netanyahu makes no secret that he also doesn't want to see that Iran is that the issue of Iranian support to Hezbollah, which is the most competent militia in the Middle East, is left undiscussed. And so we end up with a situation where the Israelis don't want this, the Saudis don't want this, and then you look at the fact that President Obama was not able or not willing to take this to the Congress to get any kind of support from the Congress, and next thing you know, the president pulls out of it. Well, that was a pretty fateful decision, because when you pull out of something and you're walking backwards, you better check where you're walking to. And we don't seem to have a sort of follow-up process to this. Now, for a while, it seemed that the Europeans would say, okay, Americans, if you don't want to be in it, fine. We're going to stay in it. We're going to work with them. And it looked like we were going to give them waivers to buy Iranian oil, et cetera. Well, those waivers have now run out, and Secretary Pompeo said no more waivers for the Europeans. So now we have a situation where we're kind of forcing the Europeans into this situation of pulling out of the agreement, and we have no idea what goes next. In the meantime, we have Secretary Pompeo and Bolton beginning a kind of crisis. It's important to judge a foreign policy team by a crisis, but not when they make the crisis themselves. And that is what's been going on. So as I speak to you, we have a kind of uninformed way forward, except that the president did say, I'm not interested in war with Iran, and I'm not interested in regime change. Positive statement. But what's he doing with this National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and the Secretary of State, who seem to indicate they want regime change? The president's going to have to deal with that. So as we look at the world, and I know I'm kind of getting to the end here. I've got 3 minutes. All right. So you were supposed to go like this. Yeah. Really, I'm used to it. It's all right. So we have essentially 3 crises. One, the North Korea crisis, where we don't have a sense that they are prepared to give up their nuclear weapons, and we don't have something on offer that they would be interested in. We have an idea of more sanctions, but this is a country where putting sanctions against them is like throwing Brer Rabbit in the briar patch. They love it. You know, I remember in some of my other assignments, I was in this tiny little country in the Balkans called Albania, and I mean, they had this communist dictator and said, let us work, let us live, let us study as if in a state of siege. And so these sanctions are something the North Koreans are prepared to live with. And we don't seem to have a way forward. I thought it was encouraging that the president And, you know, when you're looking to President Trump over his team as the guy who's kind of thinking a little, that's kind of worrisome. But he said, all right, President Moon Jae-in, the South Korean, he said, look, I understand this is not, we're not, probably not going to get this whole thing solved in one fell swoop, and that's correct. But I don't see a diplomatic commitment to this. If you look at the alliance relationships, whether it's Canada, whether it's Europe, whether it's Mexico, elsewhere, there is real reasons to worry that the president fundamentally does not understand what alliances are. They're not business transactions. And finally, when you look at the Middle East, I think they are sort of in halftime on further violence, and we need a much more engaged process there. Frankly, you know, if you look at the Middle East in the past, you'd have regional players kind of stepping in and kind of slowing things down. You had Egypt, you had Saudi Arabia, you had Turkey, kind of acting to kind of slow the pace down. Saudi Arabia is not helpful. Egypt is completely preoccupied, and the Turks are not helpful as well. So there's a lot to be worried about. And then finally, and I'll stop at this point, if you're going to have diplomacy, you know, it helps now and again to have a few diplomats. And I am very, you know, I mean, I am very concerned with where the State Department is going. And, you know, the contrast of a few years ago, I remember I was once in the Situation Room, and I was coming in to talk about Kosovo. I think they had the Northern Ireland crowd there, and there was one other group there. And so I walk in, there's Tom Pickering dealing with the Northern, whatever the third issue was. Then there was Mitchell dealing with the Northern Ireland thing, and then Secretary Cohen dealing actually on the issue I was talking about, Kosovo. All happened to be Bowdoin grads, I might add. And you sort of felt, hey, we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. We're going to get through Northern Ireland. We're going to get through these things. Now you don't see that kind of situation. You see people who are sort of feeling around the dark, who have no sense of it, and no sense of the sort of modesty that you should have when you're dealing with the world's problems. And I think our country needs to get through this. We are a very powerful, extraordinary country, and I think we need to get back our sense of dignity, our sense of honor. And, you know, when we do that, we'll be okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.